When we think of the Vikings, an image often pops into our minds. Fierce warriors with longbows, long beards, and a lust for battle. These images have been painted by centuries of stories, sagas, and movies. But what if we've been seeing the Vikings all wrong? What if the reality is more complex, more nuanced than the stereotypical blonde-haired, blue-eyed raiders we've come to associate with the term Viking? The truth is, the Vikings were not just a group of genetically pure Scandinavians. They were much more diverse than we have been led to believe. They were a people who mixed, mingled, and interacted with a variety of cultures and populations across Europe, shaping the world in ways we are still uncovering today. And it's not just in their culture. Their very genes have traveled through the centuries, leaving a genetic footprint that is still visible in modern populations. This is the story of the genetic legacy of the Vikings, a legacy that transcends time, a story of migration, assimilation, and genetic blending. This is not just about a group of people who lived over 1,000 years ago. This is about understanding how their movements, their interactions, and their identity shaped the genetic makeup of the modern world. Before we dive deeper into how the Vikings' genetic legacy is still influencing us today, take a moment to think. Have you ever wondered if you could trace Viking roots in your own family tree? Maybe you're closer to Viking ancestry than you think. In today's video, we'll explore the truth behind the Viking identity. Are they truly a genetically homogenous group of Nordic warriors? Or is there something deeper at play? We'll take a look at the science, the ancient DNA studies, and the evidence from across Europe that paints a far more complicated picture of the Vikings than you might expect. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button. Trust me, you won't want to miss the rest of this journey. Let's dive into the genetic legacy of the Vikings, starting with how the myths around them have shaped what we think we know, and how science is now revealing a more diverse and fascinating reality. When we think of Vikings, we often envision a group of people who were purely Scandinavian, one homogeneous tribe with a single genetic heritage. But what if I told you that this is a myth? The truth is, the Vikings were far more diverse than you might have ever imagined. Imagine this. Vikings sailed far and wide, not just across seas, but across genetic lines. They didn't just invade or settle, they mixed, traded, and lived alongside different cultures. And through their genetic exchanges, they became something more than just the Norse warriors we see in movies and textbooks. It turns out, Vikings were not a pure genetic group, despite what we've been taught for centuries. A series of groundbreaking genetic studies have shown that Vikings were made up of people from various parts of Europe. They weren't just blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors. No, the Vikings had connections to Southern Europe, the British Isles, and even regions in Asia. Their genetic footprint is far more complex than the stereotypical image we've all come to expect. Now, take a moment to think about this. What if you discovered that a part of your ancestry traces back to the Viking Age? Could you possibly be one of the modern-day descendants of these seafaring explorers, who mixed with people across Europe? Recent ancient DNA research has confirmed that Viking populations were not as homogeneous as once thought. In fact, studies analyzing over 440 Viking-era genomes from different regions reveal something surprising. Genetic influences from the Mediterranean, the British Isles, and even parts of Asia. Vikings weren't just raiding. They were actively blending with the populations they encountered. Let's break this down. Vikings from Denmark often ventured to England, leaving behind traces of their DNA in the modern British population. But here's the twist. Viking men from Scandinavia didn't just leave their mark genetically. Viking women did too. Mitochondrial DNA from Viking graves shows that many Viking women came from areas like the British Isles, reflecting a unique blend of cultures that continues to echo in the DNA of modern Europeans. Think about it. What would it mean if Viking identity was shaped more by culture than by genetic purity? Could this explain why people from different parts of Europe today might find traces of Viking ancestry in their DNA, even if they don't have a direct connection to Scandinavia? The Vikings, as it turns out, weren't a one-dimensional group. They were a collection of people who embraced multiple cultural influences, and that's a big part of why their legacy is still with us today. The genetic mixture they left behind tells a story of constant movement, assimilation, and evolution, not just one of conquest and war. Now, as we uncover more of these genetic secrets, it becomes clear. The true Viking legacy isn't just about raiding and plundering. It's about connection, culture, and the merging of different worlds. And when you look at their genetic legacy, you start to realize that Vikings, in a way, were ahead of their time. They understood the value of cultural exchange long before globalization became a buzzword. So, next time you hear the word Viking, remember this. Vikings weren't a single, pure genetic group. They were part of something much bigger, a tapestry of humanity that spans continents, cultures, and millennia. When we talk about tracing ancestry, we usually think of simple family trees. But with Vikings, it's different. Instead of looking at records, we're diving deep into their DNA to uncover who they really were and where they came from. And trust me, the story gets even more fascinating the deeper we go. Imagine having the ability to unlock the past, not through old manuscripts or monuments, but through the very cells of the Vikings themselves. How would you feel if you could trace your heritage back to the very blood that flowed through the veins of those who conquered lands, sailed the seas, and established kingdoms? Recent breakthroughs in genetic research have allowed scientists to extract DNA from Viking remains, revealing some shocking truths. It's not just about knowing who your great-great-grandparents were. With the Vikings, it's about uncovering an intricate network of connections that spanned across Europe and beyond. It's about understanding the deep genetic ties that link these ancient warriors to us. Let's start with the basics. Viking DNA, passed down from father to son, has some key markers that tell us a lot about their origins. One of the most notable is haplogroup I1. This marker is particularly common in Scandinavian men and is often referred to as the Norse lineage. It's found in high frequencies in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. But here's the twist. This marker is also found in parts of the UK, especially where the Vikings established strongholds. So, could you be walking around with Viking DNA if your family hails from these regions? What if the ancestor who passed that genetic marker down to you sailed in one of those longboats? It's a possibility that's more real than you might think. Now, let's talk about haplogroup R1A, a genetic marker commonly found in the Vikings, especially those from Sweden and Norway. This particular haplogroup is deeply connected with the ancient European populations and their migration patterns. It's believed to have played a major role in the Viking expansions, especially as Swedish Vikings ventured into the Baltic, Russia, and beyond. Could it be that these ancient bloodlines are still influencing some of the genetic makeup in today's European populations? But it's not just the men who left their mark. Viking women, through their mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, also carry markers that tell their own story. Haplogroups like U, K, V, and I show up frequently in Viking remains. These markers tell us that Viking women weren't just bystanders in Viking history. They were active participants in the settlement and expansion of Norse culture. Many of them came from the British Isles, the continent, and even the Far East. This mix of bloodlines suggests that Viking identity wasn't just about being from Scandinavia. It was about a cultural and social connection that transcended borders. Now, pause for a second and think about this. If you've ever wondered about your own ancestry and what makes you unique, imagine how many layers of history are encoded in your genes. Could there be a Viking ancestor lurking somewhere in your bloodline? It's a question worth asking because, with genetic testing, you might just be able to find the answer. For example, did you know that Vikings carry genetic markers that can still be found in modern populations? Haplogroup I1, the hallmark of Viking males, is still prevalent in regions like Sweden, Denmark, and even parts of the British Isles, where Vikings once settled. But here's the fascinating part. This isn't just about ancient bones and skulls. It's about how these markers have made their way into the genetic code of people alive today. You might be asking, so, how can I know if I have Viking DNA? Well, it's not as far-fetched as it seems. Genetic testing companies today can compare your DNA with ancient Viking markers. The results might just surprise you. That family lore you've always heard about being related to Norsemen, it might actually hold more truth than you think. As we uncover these genetic markers, we realize the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were the architects of a lasting genetic legacy that still influences the world today. Their migrations, their battles, their settlements, all left a complex, vibrant genetic imprint. And in many ways, we carry that legacy with us. Picture this. Longboats cutting through the misty waters of the North Sea. Vikings setting sail from Scandinavia. Their destination unknown. It wasn't just about raiding and conquering. They were exploring, settling, and shaping the genetic landscape of Europe. These seafaring people weren't just warriors. They were pioneers, mixing their bloodlines with the locals wherever they went. But how did these migrations affect the genetic makeup of modern populations? Let's dive into that question, because the answer is more complicated and more fascinating than you might think. The Vikings didn't just stay in Scandinavia. Their reach stretched from the icy shores of Greenland to the sun-drenched coasts of the Mediterranean. They didn't just invade, they mingled, mixed, and left their genetic mark. And we can trace that influence across Europe today. But here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't all go to the same places. Each Viking group had its own migration path, and each one left a different kind of legacy. Danish Vikings, for instance, focused heavily on England, and their genetic influence is still detectable in the modern British population. Could you be part of the Viking legacy in England? In some regions, studies show up to 6% of the population's genes can be traced back to Viking ancestry. Think about it. Could you have a Viking warrior somewhere in your family tree? The idea seems almost too good to be true, but the evidence is right there in the DNA. Then there are the Norwegians. They headed west, settling in Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of North America. But their genetic imprint didn't stop with the men. Viking men brought Scandinavian genes with them, but Viking women played an equally important role. In Iceland, for example, the male Viking ancestry is clear. But when you look at the maternal lines, you find a significant contribution from the British Isles. This reveals an even deeper story of migration and mixing. Could the women who accompanied the Vikings be as important to their legacy as the men who wielded the swords? And don't forget the Swedish Vikings. Their journey took them east, through the Baltic region and all the way to Russia. They didn't just trade, they intermarried, formed alliances, and, of course, left behind traces of their DNA. In places like Latvia and Estonia, you can still find genetic links to these ancient Swedish Vikings. So if your ancestry has roots in the Baltic region, there might be a surprise waiting for you in your family history. But what does this all mean for the genetic map of modern Europe? The Vikings didn't just leave behind stories of raiding. They left behind a legacy of intermingling, shared genetics, and a deep cultural exchange that reshaped the DNA of entire regions. In fact, it's been estimated that up to 20% of the modern Irish population carries genetic markers linked to Viking ancestry. Imagine that. The Vikings didn't just settle in Ireland. They became a part of the very fabric of the population. Now here's a thought to keep in mind. Could you be connected to these ancient Viking settlers in ways you never imagined? What if some of that Viking blood runs through your veins, even though your ancestors might not have ever set foot in Scandinavia? As we explore the genetic impact of Viking migrations, we realize just how intertwined these seafaring people were with the regions they touched. Their legacy is not just in their settlements. It's in the very DNA of modern Europe. From the northernmost tips of Scotland to the farthest reaches of the Baltic, the Vikings didn't just change the map, they changed the people themselves. And their influence is still with us today. When we think about the Vikings, we often imagine the fearless men who sailed across seas, raided villages, and founded empires. But there's a side to Viking history that's often overlooked: the Viking women. These women weren't just passive passengers on the longboats. They were active participants in the Viking Age, playing a crucial role in the expansion and settlement of the Norse world. Imagine a woman standing on the shores of Iceland, looking out at the vast ocean, knowing that she's not just helping to establish a colony. She's part of a far-reaching legacy that will shape generations to come. This was the reality for many Viking women who, through their genes, their actions, and their stories, played an irreplaceable role in the Viking diaspora. Let's take a moment to think about this. What role did these women really play in shaping the Viking legacy? Were they just the wives and mothers we often read about? Or did they have a hand in the exploration, the settling, and the creation of the Viking world? Research has uncovered some astonishing truths. DNA studies have revealed that Viking women were just as important as their male counterparts in establishing Viking settlements. In Iceland, the evidence is clear. While Viking men made up the majority of the early settlers, the women they brought with them were predominantly from the British Isles. Could it be that these women carried more than just their cultural practices? Could their genetic contributions have shaped the future of the Viking colonies? Take a look at the archaeological evidence. In Viking burials across Scandinavia, the presence of women with unique genetic markers from distant lands tells a fascinating story. These women weren't just wives, they were leaders, traders, and settlers in their own right. Many came from places like Ireland, Scotland, and beyond, and in some areas, their contributions to the local populations were just as significant as those of the men. But what does this mean for us today? Can you trace a Viking woman in your family tree? If your ancestry is linked to regions like Ireland, Scotland, or the North Atlantic Islands, chances are you might be carrying traces of Viking women in your DNA. These women were not mere bystanders. They were the women who made history, and their legacy is still alive in the genes of millions. The role of Viking women wasn't just limited to settling new lands. Many of these women took on roles as power brokers, landowners, and even warriors. Archaeological sites in places like Sweden and Denmark reveal evidence of women buried with weapons, symbolizing their active participation in Viking society. Could it be that these women were more involved in Viking conquests than we've been led to believe? What if their role in Viking expansion was just as vital as the men's? These women didn't just passively follow the men, they were integral to the cultural and genetic mixing that defines the Viking world today. As they mingled with local populations, married local men, and built families, they helped to create a genetic mosaic that would go on to shape the populations of Europe for centuries. When we think about the Vikings, we need to broaden our perspective. They were not just a group of men conquering lands. They were a society built on the contributions of both men and women. Viking women played a foundational role in the growth of Viking culture, and their genetic legacy is still visible today in the modern populations of Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, and beyond. So, the next time you think of the Vikings, remember this. Their legacy isn't just in the men who sailed the seas, but also in the women who helped shape the world they left behind. These women were more than just the mothers and wives of Viking warriors. They were the unsung architects of the Viking diaspora, whose contributions have lasted for over 1,000 years. What if I told you that the Vikings left more than just stories and legends in their wake? What if, just maybe, some of their blood still runs through our veins today? It's easy to think of the Vikings as a thing of the past, longboats, swords, and distant kingdoms. But what if I told you that their genetic legacy is alive and well, hidden within modern populations? Imagine this. You're looking at your family tree, tracing your roots, and discovering that a part of your ancestry is linked to the Vikings. It might sound like a fantasy, but the truth is, it's more likely than you think. Viking DNA has survived the centuries and still lives on in the populations of places they once conquered, settled, and mingled with. So how can we trace this ancient legacy? Well, it all starts with modern genetic research. Thanks to groundbreaking DNA studies, we now know that the Vikings didn't just disappear. They became part of the genetic fabric of Europe. Their genes didn't just fade away. They were absorbed into the very populations they interacted with. Take Iceland, for example. When we look at the genetic makeup of modern Icelanders, we find that around 55% of their genetic heritage can be traced back to Scandinavia. But here's the fascinating part. Nearly half of that genetic makeup comes from the British Isles. That means, while Viking men came from Scandinavia, their women were often from places like Scotland, Ireland, and even England. Imagine that half of Iceland's Viking ancestry comes from women of Celtic descent. Isn't it amazing how their genetic contribution helped shape the identity of an entire nation? But it's not just Iceland. Let's think about Ireland. Research shows that nearly 20% of the male population carries Viking ancestry. Now, take a moment to ask yourself, could you have Viking roots in your Irish heritage? The Viking presence in Ireland wasn't just a flash in the pan. They established settlements, built cities, and integrated into the local culture. That means their genetic influence is still alive today, thriving in the DNA of modern Irish people. Now, Let's take a step over to Britain. Studies have shown that in areas with heavy Viking influence, like parts of northern England, up to 6% of population's genes can be traced back to the Vikings. Imagine standing in a town in the UK and knowing that some of the very people you're walking past could have Viking ancestors. The Vikings didn't just raid and leave, they stayed, they mingled, and they became part of the population. Their genes became part of the British Isles' heritage. But how far does this genetic legacy go? Could Viking DNA be present in other parts of Europe as well? The answer is yes. Even in places like the Baltic and parts of Northern Europe, traces of Viking DNA can still be found. In fact, some estimates suggest that Viking genetic influence might even reach into parts of modern-day Russia, Latvia, and Estonia. The Vikings were not just confined to one region. They were global travelers, and their DNA followed the same paths. Here's the big question. Could you be one of the millions of people today who carries the genetic legacy of the Vikings? With genetic testing becoming more accessible, it's easier than ever to trace your own Viking roots. Imagine the thrill of finding out that part of your DNA comes from those legendary seafarers who crossed oceans and shaped history. Wouldn't that be something to discover? As you look at your own family tree, think about this. Every single person in Europe, and even beyond, carries some trace of the people who shaped our world. The Vikings, with their longboats, their battles, and their migrations, left a lasting imprint on history. And thanks to modern science, we can trace that legacy through our genes, understanding more about who we are and where we come from. So, next time you hear about the Vikings, remember, their legacy isn't just in the sagas and stories. It's in the very DNA of millions of people across the world, maybe even yours. Imagine standing on the edge of history, looking at a world shaped by seafaring explorers, warriors, and traders. Vikings, whose stories we've all heard, left behind more than just sagas. They left their DNA. But how much of that ancient legacy still exists in us today? The truth is, the Vikings didn't just conquer lands. They mingled, they settled, and most importantly, they intertwined their genetic legacy with the populations they encountered. And here's the wild part. This genetic connection still lives on today, in ways you might not expect. Now, think about your own family tree. Could there be traces of Viking blood hidden in your DNA? It's more likely than you think, especially when you realize just how far and wide the Vikings went and how deeply they integrated with other cultures. Modern genetic studies reveal that up to 10% of Scandinavians today carry genes directly linked to Viking ancestors. But the legacy doesn't stop there. In places like Ireland and Britain, where Viking influence was most prominent, the genetic imprint is still strong. In fact, 6% of the current population in Britain has Viking ancestry. That's right. Up to 6% of the people you walk past on the streets could have a Viking connection, buried deep in their genetic makeup. But what about the rest of Europe? Could you have Viking ancestors if your roots don't lie in the north? Well, if your heritage stretches across northern Europe, chances are the Vikings left their mark there too. In countries like Ireland, Scotland, and parts of France, the genetic legacy is undeniable. In Iceland, the percentage of Viking DNA is so high that 55% of Icelanders can trace their ancestry back to Scandinavian settlers. But there's a twist. Almost half of Iceland's Viking roots come from women of Celtic descent, blending the genetic legacy in a way we never really considered before. But why does this matter today? Why should we care about Viking genetics in the modern world? Think of it like this. What if your family history contains a piece of the most dynamic, transformative period of European history? The Vikings were not just raiders and warriors. They were builders, explorers, and the first global travelers of their time. Their influence is woven into the genetic fabric of much of modern Europe, and now, thanks to advancements in DNA testing, it's easier than ever to uncover those connections. Here's a fascinating question for you. What if you could directly link yourself to a Viking ancestor with just a simple DNA test? Imagine tracing your roots back through centuries of Viking history, discovering which regions your ancestors may have settled in, and learning about the cultural influence that shaped your heritage. As you start thinking about these possibilities, consider this. The Vikings didn't just leave a physical mark. They left a lasting imprint on the way people lived, interacted, and survived across Europe. And while Viking ships may have sailed long ago, their legacy still moves through the world today, carried on by the descendants of the very people they interacted with. So, the next time you hear someone talk about the Vikings, ask yourself, could they be talking about your ancestors? Could your DNA be telling a story that stretches back to the Viking Age? This connection is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder of how deeply our past shapes who we are today. The Vikings may have vanished from the pages of history, but their genetic legacy, that lives on in all of us. When you think of Vikings, what comes to mind? Fierce men, right? The warriors with swords and shields, ready to conquer. But here's the question. What if I told you that the true heart of Viking expansion, culture, and legacy is just as much linked to Viking women as it is to Viking men? We often forget that Vikings didn't just bring their ships and swords. They brought their families, their wives, their daughters, and, yes, their mothers. These women were essential not only in keeping the Viking world alive, but in shaping the very culture that expanded from the fjords of Scandinavia to the farthest reaches of Europe. Imagine a Viking woman stepping off a longship onto foreign shores. She's not just a passenger. She's a key player in settling new lands, weaving the fabric of what would become Iceland, the Shetlands, or even parts of the British Isles. These women weren't just caretakers. They were pioneers. But here's something to think about. What if you've never truly understood the power and significance of these Viking women? What if their legacy is still influencing your life today? Recent genetic studies have shed light on just how crucial these women were. Viking-era DNA from places like Iceland reveals that while Viking men may have sailed across seas to conquer, the women they brought with them, often from regions like the British Isles, played an equally vital role in establishing new communities. Not just by marrying Viking men, but by carrying with them distinct lineages, cultural practices, and values that shaped the regions they settled in. Iceland is the perfect example. Modern Icelanders trace nearly 55% of their ancestry back to Scandinavia. But did you know that much of that Viking ancestry is from Celtic women? The men came from Scandinavia, but their wives, daughters, and mothers often hailed from the British Isles. So, when we think about the Viking legacy, we need to recognize that half of that legacy is carried by women who were just as integral to Viking expansion. It's wild to think about, right? Women, often left out of history's grand narratives, were the ones who helped shape the future of Viking civilization. And they did this not only through bloodlines, but through their roles as mothers, traders, and landowners. Now, take a moment to ask yourself, could you have Viking blood from a woman who sailed from the British Isles centuries ago? If your ancestry is linked to Ireland, Scotland, or Iceland, there's a good chance that Viking women contributed to your genetic legacy. But the story doesn't end with just settlement. Viking women didn't sit in the background. They were warriors, too. Yes, warrior women. There's archaeological evidence of Viking graves containing weapons, jewelry, and other tools of the trade, suggesting that some women were not just bystanders in Viking society, but participants in the very battles that spread Norse influence across Europe. Imagine these women, not only as settlers but as fighters, carving their own space in Viking history. What does this mean for us today? Could your ancestors have been among the warrior women who shaped the Viking world? With modern DNA testing, you can trace your own connection to these remarkable women. The markers they left behind in their genes tell a story of bravery, culture, and survival that echoes through the centuries. So, when we look back at Viking history, let's not forget that the legacy isn't just about the men who sailed across the seas. It's about the women who sailed with them, who stayed behind, and who helped build the Viking world we recognize today. Picture this. The Vikings, those legendary seafaring warriors, spread their influence across Europe, leaving a mark not just on history, but on the very DNA of the populations they encountered. They didn't just raid, they settled, integrated, and created new societies. And what if I told you that their genetic footprint can still be found in the populations of modern Europe? Now, let's pause for a moment. Could you, right now, be living with a part of Viking history inside you? Imagine a connection stretching back over 1,000 years, hidden in your genes, waiting to be uncovered. You see, Viking migrations weren't just about conquering. They were about blending cultures, trading ideas, and yes, leaving behind genetic traces that are still detectable today. So how did they do this? How did the Vikings spread their legacy so far and wide? It's all about their incredible reach and the lasting impact they had on the regions they touched. Take England, for instance. Vikings settled heavily in places like York, Northumbria, and the Danelaw, areas that still carry the imprint of their ancestry. In fact, recent studies suggest that up to 6% of modern Brits might have Viking DNA. Imagine that. 1 out of every 20 people in the UK could trace their roots back to Viking settlements. How does that change the way you see your own ancestry? Could you be among the descendants of those Viking explorers? But it's not just England. The Vikings were all over Ireland, where they didn't just raid, they integrated, trading with local populations and leaving behind a strong genetic legacy. If your heritage is tied to the Irish, there's a good chance that Viking blood runs through your veins. Studies estimate that 20% of the Irish male population carries genetic markers linked to Viking ancestry. Could you have Viking ancestors who helped shape the landscape of Ireland? And then there's Scotland, a place deeply influenced by the Vikings. In the Northern Isles like Orkney and Shetland, Viking genetic contributions are especially high. These regions boast up to 70% Viking ancestry. That's more than half the population. Imagine growing up in a place where Viking history isn't just taught in books. It's literally in the people around you. If your roots are tied to the Scottish Isles, chances are you're carrying more Viking blood than you might think. But it doesn't stop at the British Isles. The Viking influence stretches all the way to Eastern Europe. In places like Russia and the Baltic states, you'll find traces of Swedish Vikings who ventured eastwards, trading and mixing with local populations. Even today, in places like Latvia and Estonia, the genetic legacy of these Viking travelers is detectable. Think about it. Could your roots be intertwined with Viking explorers who set sail towards the east, as far as the lands that are now Russia? But let's think bigger for a moment. The Vikings didn't just leave a genetic legacy. They created a genetic mosaic. Their genes were absorbed into the very populations they settled in. And that impact can be seen in modern Europeans, whether it's in the genes of people living in the UK, Ireland, Sweden, or even the far reaches of Russia. Here's the key takeaway. The Vikings didn't just shape the geography of Europe. They shaped the very people who live there today. Their legacy is embedded in modern populations, carried forward through the centuries by the people who inherited their genes. So, do you think the Vikings could still be influencing you today, living in the genetic makeup of millions of Europeans? As you dig deeper into your own ancestry, consider this. Could Viking DNA be the key to unlocking parts of your past that you never knew existed? Imagine tracing your family history back to those bold explorers, conquerors, and settlers who left their mark on the world, and still do. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine men with axes and shields, conquering lands and taking over territories. But what about the women who sailed alongside them, the ones who settled, fought, and helped create the Viking world as we know it today? Picture this: Viking women stepping onto foreign shores, not just as wives or mothers, but as leaders, warriors, and visionaries. These women weren't mere bystanders in Viking society. They were integral to its expansion and survival. In fact, many of the Viking colonies wouldn't have survived without them. What did these Viking women do? And how did they leave their mark on history? Let's explore their role, from their contributions in battle to their vital place in Viking settlements. These women were not just settlers, they were strategists, traders, and builders of the Viking Empire. In places like Iceland, the role of Viking women was crucial. Many women came from Ireland, Scotland, and other Celtic regions. This isn't just about who they married. It's about the genes they brought with them, the customs they carried, and the culture they helped establish in these new lands. Imagine being one of these women, carrying traditions from a faraway land and using your skills to ensure the survival of a community. But it's not just about the genetic legacy. Some Viking women were buried with weapons and armor, indicating they were active in battle. Could these women have been warriors, too? Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking women sometimes took part in raids, wars, and even defended their homes. Today, when we think of Viking history, we need to consider the women who made it possible. They weren't just bystanders. They were active architects of the Viking world. Here's a question for you. Have you ever wondered if there's a bit of Viking blood running through your veins? Maybe you've heard stories of ancestors who came from the far north, or maybe you've just always had a fascination with Viking history. What if I told you that it's not just history, it's still alive in your DNA? Viking expansion left an indelible mark on Europe's genetic landscape, and many modern Europeans can trace their heritage back to the seafaring Norsemen. The impact of Viking settlements goes far beyond the pages of history books. It's embedded in the very genetic makeup of millions of people today. So, how do we know this? Through advanced DNA studies, scientists have traced Viking genetic markers across Europe. In Iceland, nearly 55% of the population carries genetic markers linked to Scandinavian ancestry. But here's the twist. Nearly half of that genetic legacy comes from Celtic women. Imagine that. Viking settlers in Iceland may have been mostly men, but their wives and daughters played an equally important role in the creation of the Icelandic gene pool. In Ireland and Scotland, Viking DNA is even more pronounced. Some regions show that up to 20% of population carries Viking ancestry. In England, places like York and the Danelaw have significant Viking genetic influence, with as much as 6% of the British population today carrying Viking blood. But Viking DNA isn't limited to the British Isles or Scandinavia. It stretches all the way to the Baltic, Russia, and even parts of Western Europe. Could your ancestors be among the Viking settlers who spread their genes across the continent? The evidence is right there in modern genetic testing, and the results might just surprise you. The Viking legacy is alive in all of us. With today's genetic testing, it's possible to trace your own Viking roots. Imagine unlocking your Viking ancestry, finding out where your ancestors settled, and connecting with a history that spans over 1,000 years. The Vikings left an extraordinary legacy, one that shaped the world in ways we're still uncovering. From their seafaring adventures to their cultural exchanges, the Vikings didn't just change the geography of Europe, they changed its very genetic makeup. But what does this legacy mean for us today? How does Viking DNA influence us in the modern world? And why should we care about tracing it? Let's start with health. Did you know that some genetic traits linked to Viking ancestry can still be seen in modern populations? For example, Dupuytren's contracture, often called Viking disease, is a genetic condition that's more common in Northern European populations. This condition, which causes the fingers to contract, is believed to have been passed down from the Vikings and is still prevalent in modern Scandinavian populations. But Viking DNA doesn't just impact health, it impacts identity. As we trace our own DNA, many of us are discovering that we're connected to the Vikings in ways we never imagined. With the rise of DNA testing, people around the world are finding that their ancestry includes traces of Viking heritage. It's not just about knowing where we come from. It's about understanding the incredible people who helped shape the world we live in. The legacy of Viking DNA also stretches into culture. From place names in Britain to customs in Ireland, the Vikings left their cultural mark wherever they went. Even today, elements of Viking culture, like Norse mythology, Viking art, and traditions, continue to influence us. So, why does Viking DNA matter today? Because it connects us to a history that's as rich and complex as the people who lived it. It reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It's woven into the very fabric of who we are. The Viking legacy is one of exploration, connection, and survival. But it's also one of DNA, culture, and enduring influence. As we continue to study the genetic footprints of the Vikings, we uncover more about our past and more about ourselves. And the best part? This journey isn't over. With each new discovery, we learn more about the profound impact these seafaring people had on shaping the world. Could you be a part of that legacy? The journey to uncover your Viking roots is more than just historical curiosity. It's about finding connections that go beyond time, discovering the ancestors who helped shape not just your lineage but the world. The Vikings may have been gone for over 1,000 years, but their legacy is still with us, alive in our DNA, in our culture, and in our story.